Psalm 123. As we continue a devotional series, basically, of these songs of degrees, we're not really doing an in-depth study of each one, but hopefully the things we touch upon are an encouragement to our hearts as we think about this. And I'm not going to do the review again of why there's 15 and why Hezekiah probably wrote 10. And why David and Solomon's were put in there. But it's interesting, if indeed, and this is an assumption, I think there's validity to it, but we can't prove that these were all written by Hezekiah relating to the time of his illness, but it does say after he recovered he wrote Psalms, and it would make sense that these would be the ones. But as we look at Psalm 120, just going back by way of review, you will notice that the psalm begins with distress. In my distress, I cried to the Lord, and he heard me. Now, when the Bible speaks about God hearing our prayers, it does not mean that he can't hear some of our prayers. When it says he hears our prayers, that means he answers yes. He hears the request, and he's granting the request. That's what it means by he hears our prayer. So the first psalm in this series was in my distress I cried, and we can see Hezekiah in that situation. And then Psalm 121, in other words, he's in 120, he's going through a trial, so he cries out. In 121, he speaks of his trust, from trial to trust. He says, I will lift up my eyes to the hills, from whence comes my help. My help comes from the Lord. So in this trial, he fixes his eyes on the Lord, and he's trusting him. And then when we get to Psalm 122, we see his triumph. He's rejoicing. I was glad when they said to me, let us go into the house of the Lord. And so that's really a progression that ought to be part of our lives, that when we come to a trial, we need to trust him. If you're like me, when you start a trial, your first response is not to cry to the Lord. Now, maybe yours is all the time, but I usually, start thinking, how can I fix this? Or I fret about it. And then finally, I need to commit this to the Lord. And my faithful wife oftentimes reminds me, let's just pray about that. We were having a minor trial tonight, and as I told Wendy, I kind of almost lost my sanctification. I was getting so frustrated. But in any event, so we cry to the Lord. That's the first place we should go. And then as God moves and we see his answers, we rejoice, and that's what Psalm 122 is all about. Well, Psalm 123 kind of begins this cycle again, because Psalm 123, he's talking about his trials, that he's going through something difficult. He says, unto you I lift my eyes, you who dwell in the heavens. Behold, as the eyes of the servants look to the hand of their masters, and so forth. But why do I say this is a trial? Well, look at verses 3 and 4. Have mercy on us, O Lord, have mercy on us. We are exceedingly filled with contempt. And that means the adversaries are mocking, and so forth. Our soul is exceedingly filled with the scorn of those who are at ease, and the contempt of the proud. And if we look at it through Hezekiah's eyes, I can imagine, Sennacherib's army and his spokesman, the Rabshakeh and so forth, speaking. They're probably mocking them. Hezekiah. Well, they did, as a matter of fact. They said, "You're not going to trust in the God that Hezekiah is talking about. Didn't he tear down all their idols?" Which he didn't, but that's what he said. And he says, "Look at all the other nations. They can't stand before me. How are you going to stand before me?" So he had them in derision. And they had him in, so he was, again, recounting that trial that he was going through because of the opposition of the enemy. But I'd like us to go back to Psalm 3 for a moment. And Psalm 3 was written by whom and when? What was the circumstance?
David, when he fled from Absalom, his son.
Right. It was a psalm of David, and it was when he was fleeing from his son Absalom. Now, how do we know that that's correct? It's printed, it's in the block letter. That means it's part of the inspired text. Now, right above that, I have in italics a morning psalm. Well, that's what man put in there. So if it's in italics, that's what man put in. But the block letters are what God put in. But anyhow, when he was fleeing from Absalom, he was going through kind of what Hezekiah was talking about, the scorning, the mocking of individuals. Lord, how have they increased who troubled me? Many are they who rise up against me. Many are they who say of me, there is no help for him in God. So that's that mocking. And this happens through the ages. When Christians go through trials, very often they say, well, where's your God now? And they will mock at that notion. And as he went through that trial, but notice verse 3, the turning point. But you, O Lord, are a shield for me, my glory, and the one who lifts up my head. That means he will exalt eventually in that. And so that Psalm of David is similar to what we're reading about here in Psalm 123. If indeed it is a Psalm of Hezekiah, they're mocking me, but I look to you. Behold, as the eyes of the servants look to the hand of their masters. As I used to read this, I thought they were looking, and this may be correct, but they're looking to their master for their provision, because the servant was dependent on the master for his livelihood. But I am told that it's really speaking about a servant, how he looks to the master, and if the master gives a gesture, then you get up and go. You know, that's looking at their hands and the signals that they're giving. There could be some of both in here, but Hezekiah here is talking about that's how we need to be in relationship to God. We're always looking at him to see what he's about to do and what he wants us to do. So I may be going through a trial, and people around me may be mocking, where is your God now? But you keep looking and keep your eyes fixed on God. So in this trial, in Psalm 123, what does he believe? He believed in the sovereignty of God. So when printers don't work, you know, God has something to teach me. But so he says, lift up my eyes, O you who dwell in the heavens. And that's always an important thing, because, you know, what were the heathen gods like? They were in those idols. I don't know if you remember, I thought it was a fascinating story. It's not a true story, but in Jewish folklore, when Tom Simcox was here, remember he told the story how they believed that Abraham, he came out of a land of idolatry, and he destroyed all the idols with an axe. And then he put the axe in one of the idol's hands. And so when Abraham's father came and said, who destroyed these idols? And he pointed to the idol with the axe, and he says, you know that idol can't do anything. And Abraham said, aha. You remember his saying? I don't know if you do or not, but I thought that was a fascinating, because even though it's legend, it is really accurate, because that's the point. There is a true story of a native that was ready to receive the gospel, or his heart was turned to seek after God because he was carving an idol. And he thought about this, and he says, my hands made this idol. Who made me? And he sought the Lord, and then eventually missionaries came and told him about the one true God. But in every scenario, we need to keep our eyes fixed on him. Our first look should not be frustration, even though that's natural to do. Our first thought should not be to fret, but to pray. I must tell Jesus all of my troubles. That's where this begins. So he was facing the scorn of his enemy, but he said, I'm going to look to God. And that's how we should respond to our trials as well. So may God encourage us in those things. And now we want to move to praise and thanksgiving and some of your favorite songs.